My name is Alex Williams, founder of The New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast, a show about application, development, and management at scale. Thanks for joining us. The New Stack Pancake Breakfast at the Cloud Foundry Summit in Basel, Switzerland is brought to you by the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Software is at the center of business, and open source is at the center of software. With Cloud Foundry, businesses can make running software at scale a reality. Learn more about Cloud Foundry at cloudfoundry.org. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Alex Williams, founder and editor-in-chief of The New Stack. We have these pancake breakfasts, and it's just a chance for us to have a little Q&A. Basically, what we like to do is just encourage everyone to ask some questions. Our focus today really is on the future of Cloud Native DevOps. But before I get started, I want to give a big thanks to the Cloud Foundry Foundation for making this breakfast possible. Let's give them a big hand. And so I want to just say a little something before we get going. There's a lot of discussions about DevOps now, and we're thinking about, what does actually DevOps mean to people these days? And for us, we've thought a lot about how we approach it, and we really think about it as the people. And we think about, who are the teams? What are their, what are their workflows? And what are the technologies that they're using that fit with their workflows? And I think that speaks to a lot of what we see with the evolution of the Cloud Foundry technology and the whole cloud native ecosystem. And so perhaps what we might do to start is, Abby, you can just give us your perspective on how you basically are seeing the market right now. Like, what is it that you're seeing in the DevOps world, changing? What are some of the impacts that you're seeing of DevOps on the Cloud Foundry community?
Well, I'm the worst to ask about that because I actually...
You're the worst to ask about that?
I am. It's no secret. I don't like the phrase DevOps.
You don't? Why not?
I don't.
What's wrong with it?
Because I think there's so much more involved in what we think of as DevOps. So when we think about continuous delivery, continuous integration, there's so much more involved. It's not just a developer in operations. It's the line of business. It's the product owners. It's architects. It's security. It's just so many other things. And I think DevOps is an oversimplification of a larger cultural shift that's necessary to develop and iterate on software quickly at the end of the day.
Okay. So, Jeff, before I move on to everyone else, if you ask a question, you get 5 tickets and you get to win a prize. And so that's kind of that's a little bit of our pancake game theory in action here. We're hoping this will encourage you to ask some questions. But before I move, but let's move on to the, the discussion, as it relates to DevOps, because you're saying it encompasses a lot more, right? It encompasses a lot more than just this term DevOps. Julian, I'm curious in your perspective on that. Like, what is it that you're seeing in your work, in your own individual work, that is exemplary of the times?
So actually, I think I'm the worst person to ask about DevOps, as I'll now demonstrate. So I do agree, though. I think DevOps is a term that's started to mean everything and therefore nothing. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that is genuinely interesting is you want developers to more and more be able to operate their stuff and keep it running. But I think the confusion has been that means that they should do an awful lot of ops. So they should do this whole stack, and that isn't a practical thing. I think
they should do this whole stack. What do you mean? Like, they should build it all at once, or what do you mean?
So I think DevOps should mean I'm responsible for keeping my application running. But the only way that that's practical is if we've made the operations simple enough and repeatable enough for a developer to actually do. So it's not, I don't need ops now because my developer's going to do all the ops. It's, I need great ops in order to make it so that the developer can keep their application running themselves. And I think that's a different mindset. And the term DevOps can cause some confusion down the wrong path.
Who here is in operations? Raise your hand if you're in operations. Who here are like developers then? Who here are otherwise then?
Troy, what is this Troy thing? Sort of?
Would you say you're sort of
Well,
dev
can
and
you-
ops?
Can you then explain that? Here's a mic.
Troy. Troy, you thought you weren't going to be on this panel, didn't you?
Is that a serious question?
Yeah.
What am I answering?
Well, I mean, can you just expound upon it a little bit about what you're saying there?
I was just asked what I do. and I do a little bit of development, a little bit of keeping systems running, a little bit of product management. And so I'm an unusual case. So
Right.
I don't think I should be an example.
Right. Well, yeah.
I think it's possible that everyone is an unusual case because titles are so in flux right now in the industry that I don't think there is a DevOps person. Like we're hiring DevOps is what we see throughout this conference, but the actual roles that are being hired are all over the place. I mean, there's some development heavy ops and there's some ops heavy development and there's actually straight up sysadmin roles that are being called straight up sysadmin roles that are being called DevOps, but really it's about running cable. And it's so what Jules said is that it doesn't mean anything anymore because it's been so overloaded. But if you want to define it, then we can use that definition for the talk.
Well, I think there's just a lot of different approaches, aren't there? So, like in the Cloud Foundry community, we know a lot about Bosch is a focus of the Cloud Foundry technology, and and Bosch is a topic we're hearing a lot more about. Obviously, quite a bit here, but it's also then the question of how do you think about Bosch kind of in this kind of continuous delivery process versus other technologies like Kubernetes. And so I don't, so that's kind of where I'm curious about how many people are like active Kubernetes users. Great. Do you mind if we just give you the mic? So when you're using in your work, tell us about your work a little bit.
Well, currently I'm building a platform for RTL Netherlands. So I'm building a whole Kubernetes cluster and supplying them with the CI/CD tooling for it. And I'm actually coming more from the developer side. And I have a colleague that's actually more of the ops side, so we try to complement each other. And I'm trying to focus more on what Weaveworks is doing with GitOps.
Ah.
So I'm really trying to automate everything with Terraform and stuff like that.
Ah, okay. Go, yeah.
Hi. I'm a sales engineer and I talk with a lot of customers, and I think the biggest problem is not the technology. There was a Gartner report about DevOps, and they asked companies so if you implemented DevOps, did you succeed with it? And I think more than 90% said DevOps didn't solve the problems. And when I talk with my customers, they say, yeah, we are doing DevOps, and because we hired a DevOps engineer, and that's completely nonsense, because DevOps is about teamwork, and if the business owner expects something from DevOps, they expect the changes done by DevOps because organizational changes are required, but they don't want to do that organizational changes. They don't want to make their work visible in the 4 ways, etc., and all that stuff. So they just implement continuous delivery, but that doesn't solve their problems. And we should all get a step back. I sell software, but yeah, that's a problem. We just sell software, we don't solve problems right now. We have to go a step back and help our customers really solve their problems and listen to them. And then DevOps can be a solution. But right now, only on a technical perspective, it's just another technology, bunch of technologies.
Thank you. Before I go any further, I'd like to just introduce everyone too. I didn't really do a good job with that. Abby, thank you for introducing yourself. Chisara, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
So I'm Chisara. I go by Chisa, and I work with Pivotal as a technical program manager. So it's effectively, I always basically describe myself as a glorified process engineer that looks at both technical processes, people, and communication channels, and works to shorten feedback loops between those things. I think the analogous example that I would use is like, if all the teams are muscles, then a TPM is kind of like the ligament that connects the muscles, and you need different levels in different places in the body depending on what the muscle's trying to do. So.
Wow, that's really, I haven't heard that one before. That's awesome.
Thanks.
It's a really great description.
Yui?
I'm Yui Kao, Director of Product Management at Pivotal, and I'm responsible for the Pivotal Application Service. And then within the Cloud Foundry, I also wear the Cloud Foundry PMC Council Chair hat and the Runtime PMC Lead hat at the moment.
Yes, we're very excited about that.
Frederick?
Frederick, news editor, TechCrunch, not analyst, even though Alex likes to put that on there, which means I'm even more ignorant than you would think. Alex just always puts this on my calendar. He doesn't invite me anymore, so I just show up at this point.
Oh, well, okay. Well, thanks for coming. Julian?
Julian, I work for IBM. They pay me to work on open source, which is awesome and kind. At the moment, I am the project lead for Garden, which is Cloud Foundry's container engine, and Irini, which is our project to make Kubernetes an option as a scheduler in Cloud Foundry. I'm also the worst person to ask about DevOps.
Why? Why are you the worst person?
Slightly worse than Abby.
I feel like that should be on your LinkedIn as part of your bio, the worst person to ask about DevOps.
I've come to the right panel.
Well, good. So, Chisa, we were talking a little bit before you walked in. We were talking about kind of, your role in the organization. And one of the reasons we were interested in having you join us today is that you are not, you mostly kind of helping with communication, as I understand. But maybe you could help me kind of like help us clarify that a little bit about your role and how you kind of fit into the kind of this spectrum of continuous delivery and DevOps, so to speak.
Well, I'll be honest. Your name, right? Troy. Next to Troy. Yeah. I mean, I think you hit it on the head, which is that DevOps, in my mind, like many other wonderful things, is a buzzword. And they're really great because they help people rally. But you can't just put it in place and then expect it to do something. It's kind of like buying a motorcycle that you always wanted and then not getting your license and using it. You actually have to use the bicycle or use the motorcycle, know how it works, know all of the components and things, join the gang, and like, you create.
Join the gang.
You know what I mean? You create your posse, right? And I think when we use words like DevOps and any other team, it's almost ubiquitous to the point that you really, when you create something, you still need to make sure that it's integrating well with everything around it. And having a DevOps person doesn't mean that you solve your problem. And oftentimes what we do is we'll create these buckets of buzzwords and things, and we forget that they still need to talk to each other. And that's actually where the magic happens. It's constantly talking, making sure that you're making adjustments, making sure that that there are learnings happening across the teams. And so my role is to make sure that we don't forget that there are a ton of opportunities to learn the moment that things touch. And those series of concentric circles are really where the magic happens. A lot of great stuff happens, like for instance in like a given department or silo, but when synergistically we work together, that's actually where we start to change things. And we're going through so much change right now, which is why there's a lot of need for calibration and a lot of need for adjustment, and we need to make sure that we're moving with the framework as opposed to getting stuck on set examples or set terms. So that's where I come in.
Yui, I'm curious in your approach to this. I mean, you work across both in Cloud Foundry Foundation and kind of the Kubernetes and how kind of Kubernetes kind of fits with Cloud Foundry technology. In your view, is DevOps an accurate way of describing kind of the work that you do internally when you're building these new technologies and kind of like building out pivotal zone application architecture for its customers?
And I think there's certainly an aspect to it of that breaking down of walls. I used to work at like an enterprise company where you'd write like a run book, you hand it over to your ops people, you do a dry run, and they'll go do it at like midnight on Saturday, and you'll all order some Chinese food and be up for 2 hours rolling it out.
After you've been out with the motorcycle.
Yes, and so how do you get logs? You file a ticket, and maybe you'll get it a few hours later. And I think in building Cloud Foundry, in building PaaS, there's a lot more care about how do we break down the walls? How do we get the developers to be closer to the operations of the software so that they can make improvements, really feel and understand that pain on the ops side, and similarly on the ops side to the dev side. So I think in the sense of just breaking down those walls and those ticketing systems and artificial barriers because someone interpreted the compliance rules in a certain way. I think really trying to talk with people about their fears that caused them to interpret those compliance rules in that way, and really allow people to work more closely together and be aware of their metrics and how are they operating, and debug quickly, and be okay with maybe doing it live in production and hot fixing something if needed.
Frederick, we were talking last night about the Cloud Foundry Foundation and being here last year for the conference, and we were discussing about the discussion we had at a pancake breakfast last year, where we were talking a lot about Cloud Foundry and how it will fit with Kubernetes. And I'm curious on your retrospective now that you're back. You've been covering enterprise for the past year. I'm curious on some of your thoughts and insights. And we shared a bit of those last night. I wonder if you could elaborate.
Sure. I think I've covered the enterprise for longer than a year, but
well, no,
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
So last year we were all really confused, I think, about what the Cloud Foundry Foundation was doing with the container runtime.
Yeah.
I think it is more or less crystallized in talking to people now that the whole idea of the container runtime is simply run prepackaged software. Stuff you get, I think Chip called it, the Kubernetes containers. There's a new CD-ROM. You just get it, run it,
read
deal
only.
with it. And I think that's become a lot clearer, at least to me. I'm not sure if that's the understanding in the community as well, but it feels like that relationship has gotten much, much clearer. Kubernetes is kind of the infrastructure that I can now run my Cloud Foundry on. Just makes sense at this point, I think. I think that's what people want to do. That's what SUSE does, right, anyway. So it's done in production. I think it's become quite clear. And at the end, my sense is what developers and DevOps people want from Cloud Foundry is the CF push.
Yeah.
What runs underneath that should be completely
Visible.
irrelevant to anybody.
Irrelevant. Right.
But you would know more about that.
So I would say, to me, not just irrelevant, but invisible, and that's important. So I think you can think about this in terms of that DevOps discussion.
Yeah.
When did DevOps take off? It took off when we got infrastructure as a service to work.
Right.
So once we got that abstraction that hid some of those lower levels, then you could start to actually do this DevOps because it was practical to do that stuff. If what Amazon, taking that example of that early IaaS, had released was tools that made it super easy to build an IaaS, I don't think you would have had DevOps take off on top of those tools in the same way. Just giving people increasingly great tools isn't enough. You have to actually make things invisible because you want that separation, I think, between roles. It's this confusion that DevOps means the dev should do kind of the whole stack. And I think it doesn't. I think it means we have to give an interface to the platform that actually does abstract the platform away. And in that context, I think that's the value of CF Push to me. CF Push is a developer-facing abstraction that intentionally hides and thinks about what is the minimal abstraction that I need to give for developers to be productive when developing new applications. But yeah, it's great that we now also have a way to run old applications consistently across that whole thing.
We have Devin with a microphone. Does anyone have any questions? We have one here, and anyone else?
Sorry, an actual technology opinion question, because I haven't really figured it out yet myself. But so CF push basically hides from you a little CI/CD pipeline, a little pipeline to build your application and deploy it behind the scenes. So, but there's this entire different model that's based on source code control, tied into CI/CD, tied into deploying to some sort of infrastructure. Which way? How do we decide which way to go when you're approaching a development team or approaching a particular software project?
So I have an opportunity to be controversial on a panel, which you should always take.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people think the difference between, say, Cloud Foundry and Kubernetes is source to container or image, right? And I just completely disagree. I think the source to container thing is a nice feature because it lets you get started quickly, and because when you're doing small microservice or functional style things, it makes sense to not worry about the packaging and doing all of that stuff. But the thing that I get excited about with Cloud Foundry is not source to image. That's existed for a ton of things. Build packs are now separate. The thing I'm excited about is you should be writing 12-factor stateless apps that you let the platform run with a very regular minimal workflow for those apps, so that everything that you run in the same simple way and scale in the same simple way and fail over in the same simple way. So if you do CF push with source or CF push -o Docker image, which is in the platform today and has been in the platform for a while, I think those are both perfectly reasonable workflows. And the decision between is it source or image is just, are you getting value from bothering to build that container yourself as opposed to letting the platform build your container?
Who would disagree?
I wasn't that controversial.
Yeah.
Try
Well, why don't we
again.
just
You have
go
to work
ahead.
harder next time, Jules.
I'll try.
I mean, I think to some degree, like, it's still quite a moving target, right? Like, as software matures, like, what is that, famous, what's the below the value line and above the value line? And as more things become commodity or, like, best practices, or, if we build in a native blue-green deploy, which won't work for all cases, but might work pretty well for your WordPress site, building, making the abstractions easier so you have less to do, less to care about on your own, and you can just focus on your business value. But technology is just changing all of the time, and so what can your platform provide for you? What can it abstract away from you? And we've just seen that continue to move.
I know there's a, Devin, I know there's a question here, the gentleman in the purple shirt.
Maybe not directly a question, but something coming back to a point you made at the beginning of the discussion regarding what is DevOps. I fully agree with all that you said about what developers want from the abstraction of the platform. But for example, our department is building up the platform itself, and things completely change on this level because we try to provide a fully automated marketplace, a fully automated service to the front, to the developers. And in the back end, it's like Jira, email, Skype, talking to people, running around. And I think what, for example, our company didn't get yet is providing API-based automated interfaces between departments so that we as a platform developer can also use automated IaaS, for example. And as soon as you do not use one of the public stacks, you are really on your own there. And there is no real solution for building that up on-prem. And no matter whether I talk to people running on VMware or running on OpenStack, they all agree that it's basically a bunch of crap that you get. And it's really hard to get that up and running and provide this abstraction that the developers want.
What's difficult? What are some of the challenges you see?
One of our biggest challenges is a lack of tenancy in the IaaS. So there's a department running the VMware stack for us. And for example, you were talking about Bosch.
Right.
So if you want to connect to this stack with Bosch, you basically have to get admin access because the tenancy in the IaaS is so bad that it doesn't allow you to only access certain resources. And the people running the stack, they say, oh, we won't give you admin access to our stack. Yeah, dream on. Yeah, it's one problem. Or network automation, for example. Yeah, using several different firewall techniques. It's really hard to get this automated end to end.
Does it require a lot of internal organization then to get that?
Yes,
Yeah.
we joked about a Jira-based CPI yesterday.
I think there's a lot in, it's more than just the tech, right? It's a lot of like people and processes, and you have a 3-day approval process because you've always had a 3-day approval process. And if you look at from the time that developers are ready, feel they're ready to like push the thing out, to the time that they can actually push the thing out, depending on regulations and things, like really looking at that process and, oh, there's a review board here. And we could automate that review board and some parts of it, maybe because, through a security scan or something like that. But otherwise, like, maybe you don't need that review board at all because the platform like audited enough stuff and that review board never finds anything. They never say no, but you just always did this. And so like looking at the human processes, breaking down those barriers and just really reviewing like, what do you actually need to do? Why are you doing all these things, in your 6-month approval process? And what's holding you back from pushing to production every day, right?
She said, how does this surface up into interdepartment communications?
Yeah, I think I'm actually going to be talking about this later, and it is exactly what Yui said. It's amazing how much low-hanging fruit there is because we're trying to optimize so much to be able to push buttons to get things done, when we could really just turn to the person next to us and say, hey, by the way, could we maybe talk about this and just communicate and make it better? Do we really need this thing? Do we really need that piece of paper? Do we really have enough information in this step? And if we just wrote like a couple bullets, could that actually replace this entire process that we're going to have to do later? If I pulled you into this conversation before I started writing XYZ, does that mean that you would have enough trust and safety, trust and understanding in what I'm doing that we wouldn't have to have a 2-hour one later? And I think when we look at the process of how we do things, oftentimes we think about the process when it comes to hands-on keyboard, and we forget about all of the other peripheral stuff, and people are actually where things get slow. It's true, right? People are where things get slow. So if there are ways that we can optimize with each other, that can actually lead to a lot more cost savings. It can lead to a lot more confidence in what's being done, simply because people have visibility into what's happening. And it can also lead to a lot of time saved, especially in departments that aren't necessarily working directly with the tech. Because, I mean, for us, oftentimes, it'll be legal that has to run and peruse through documents. So helping them to make things more searchable, for instance, with licensing, is something that we could easily do by just saying, by the way, this is where the licenses are located in this source code, So I completely agree with you.
I would just like to see if there's some questions from the audience before we hear more from the panel. There's one in the back, right?
In any organization, so there is a platform, then there are application developers. Who should be driving the change? Where the question comes from, because if developers ask for features, then we end up with an unmanageable monster. On the other hand, if we don't help them with this, then they are not going to use it, and the platform is going to be useless.
Can I say? Yeah. Great question. I think whoever sees the issue should drive the change and say something. And you don't have to be the person who actually executes all the things, but I sat in several security talks yesterday, and if you see something and you see that there's an opportunity to optimize, say it, share it. And I think that's part of the problem. We'll see something someplace else in the chain, and it's well, that's not my department, so I'm not going to say anything. But really, we're just hurting ourselves, right? So regardless of where something happens, if you see a way that something can be better, I think it's important that we at least capture it and say, hey, by the way, this might be an opportunity. And then eventually someone will sit down and say, okay, well, we have this collection of different opportunities and pains that we're seeing. let's prioritize them and figure out which one it makes sense to address. But that's the thing. We can't just. I don't think that it's fair to just assume that as a developer, you're going to be the only person responsible for seeing an issue in the code, or as an operator, you're going to be the only person responsible for seeing something in the system, or as like a product manager, you're the only person who's going to see something that's off in terms of the business context. Like, we're all responsible for the whole thing, and that's the whole point of being on a team.
I think that answer kind of hints at what comes up in pretty much every discussion I have about whether that's DevOps or CI/CD or microservice or anything. It's that culture change, because not in every business is that even an opportunity, right? Not every developer feels empowered to just go and say, hey, we got to change something, and then everything else that goes with that is just not a given from at least a conversation.
Absolutely.
Or they don't see it, because there's all the silos that exist.
Exactly, yeah, they just don't know.
I think there is something important to qualify. There's a nuance, because it would be totally wrong for the only people responsible for that to be ops. But it would also, I think, and it's kind of a danger for every developer to be able to kind of unilaterally do that, because generality is often the enemy of simplicity. If you have lots of different ways of doing something, that's where you have lots of different approval processes and boards. Right? If your licenses are all in the same place in every place, you have an easier approval process. The thing about CF Push I like is every app pushes and scales the same way, right? When you need a feature, the thing about the kind of lower level model, and I'm obviously talking about Kubernetes, is if every developer can invent their own CF Push for their own team, you lose that simplicity. So how do you still get that feedback loop of, but I as a dev do need a feature in the platform, but I as ops don't want 7 ways of having that feature? That's where you need that communication. That's where there does need to be that culture shift and that flow between the two. But it has to be a flow between the two, because there's a tension. You need simplicity as well as features.
I'd like to say, like, I've seen a pattern recently of at some successful companies where they've actually started to tell different departments, tell me why we need to do this, and if we do need to do this, tell me how I can put an API in front of it. Tell me how I can put a service broker in front of that thing. Like one of the most popular ones I've been hearing recently about is the network folks. Just getting a new firewall rule, new cert, all these things. It's a meeting and a ticketing process or something like that. And a lot of companies have started actually just putting a service broker in front of it. And that, takes a shift a little bit with the network folks to trust that. But now it's, you can see what that service broker is doing. If you're good with what that did and the processes involved with that, then you can just get the network folks out of the way.
I know we have some questions. I want to make sure we get to them.
Well, my question is how do you incite this change? Because I'm having the opposite problems, and the biggest problem I'm facing as well is communication. Is that there are 5 teams, they're not communicating with each other, and like they said, they all have their own way of working with it. How do you excite those teams and make them want to do this change and want to work together and have a unified way of working with this?
How do you empower the community? How do you empower people to kind of ask those questions, right?
And I think one thing I've seen that's been really powerful is actually it's called value stream mapping, right? Which is writing out all the things that have to happen from the time that you start adding some new feature to the time it goes to production, and really understanding from your entire business, all your neuroses and processes and things, what is that? What takes 2 days here? What's really easy here? And then just having that in front of everyone, because you don't sometimes you throw it over the wall and like, oh, it's always 3 weeks, right? But if everyone can see that entire process in between code commit to actually running in production, and yes, we're actually still hitting our service level objectives, right? Actually seeing all of that mapped out and taking it to people, it's very convincing. Like, this 3-day process here, that, you know, like, can we do something here? This is probably like lowest hanging fruit.
I just want to go back to Abby quickly, though. Does this help at all in terms of what we were talking about just starting out? Like, DevOps doesn't quite kind of cover the landscape, but does this kind of clarify? Is this more kind of in line with what you're thinking about, that communication that's so critical?
Well, yeah, I think I just didn't like DevOps because I think it oversimplifies the work. I mean, I would love to say that Cloud Foundry is magical and that it solves all of your problems, and you should totally install it now because it will make your life easier. It will. And sure, but you know, I am honest to a fault sometimes, and I will say that the real work is all of the change that has to go around that. It will reinforce good behaviors, but it isn't going to make the changes for you. It's just it's forced group therapy. It'll force you all to talk about it, but it isn't going to solve your problems.
Frederick?
That's what we're doing here, group therapy. One thing, to come back to your question, one thing that comes up consistently in conversations I have is that it has to be a company-wide initiative. It can't just be one group within the company trying to do this. Or one thing that came up yesterday in a conversation was just spin up a part of the company that does it is not good enough, but spin off a part of the company and have them do it for a little project, maybe just for one country or something like that.
So,
it has worked for a lot of people, apparently.
But to be fair, because there's nothing wrong with doing a little experiment, but to the question that you were asking, all of the people who touch that thing need to be represented in that experiment. So when you're thinking about the value stream map, you can't just have, well, we have this one team with a couple developers and a product manager on it, and they're going to do this thing. You would need to have, you know, someone, the developers, you need to have the product person, you need to have whoever's dealing with like the paperwork on the other side, and everyone. So it would definitely have to be cross-cutting. So you need to make sure, if we're really running this experiment and it's going to be significant, do we have all of the I don't want to say resources, but all of the people and potentially the resources and the tools that we need to make that small experiment successful. Because and I think sometimes that's where we get caught up. We'll say, well, we're going to try this thing, but we haven't really end-to-end thought about what are all of the things. Can we really get this completely through the value stream to make sure that the results are significant?
I want to just make sure we get last question, and then we're going to have to finish it up.
We already talked about processes, and I think it could be a real eye-opener to visualize existing process to find out how insane some processes really are. And then we have a technology which can help you to automate these processes, which is called BPMN. And yeah, so you can visualize the process, and then you can see all the manual steps in it, and there are implementations for us techies which we can use to automate that stuff with whatever we want to use. That could be a technological way into process management and all that stuff.
Julian?
I'm going to say something controversial again. So I think 90% of the answer is the social answer, right? Like how do you get your organizational change, communication, getting all the right people in the room. But there is some of the answer as well that is technical, I think. The analogy I've been learning the board game Go, and when you initially learn Go, they're all white and black pieces, and it means nothing. And then you start to see the pattern. You go, oh, that's a dead cluster. That's a dead cluster. That's a live cluster, right? When you learn language, initially it's a collection of letters. I've been learning Russian. I can't speak any Russian. It's been 4 years because you can't learn the letters, right? But the way you actually read, you don't read out all the letters into a word. You see words, and then you see sentences, and you basically read the whole sentence at once, eventually. I think when you give people too many letters, it becomes really hard to communicate. You need higher level concepts. And I think when you give people this whole BPML thing, they can model any amount of complexity with that BPML thing. And that's a hard thing to communicate over. But when you have higher level things, I think that becomes easier to communicate about. When you don't have all this flexibility, when you don't have the ability to build arbitrarily complex things, people are forced to have better conversations, I think. Of, okay, here's something simple. What are the few things that I'll change from that simple bit? Instead of, how do I model my whole complex thing and then try and make it simple?
Well, let's conclude on that note. Better conversations. I think that's a good way to end this group therapy session we've had today about DevOps. Thank you, everyone, for participating. But now we have a drawing, and so we'd like to. Did everyone get a ticket?
Yeah.
All right. Abby.
Yes.
All right, drum roll.
Get your tickets out.
900973.
900973.
Yeah, yeah.
900.
All right.
Do we have a winner? Oh, he left? He's out. Let's pick another.
Keynote.
All right, 900986.
Yeah, a winner! Well, thank you all for coming out today. Let's give a big hand to the Cloud Foundry Foundation. And thank you to all the panelists. It's been a great discussion. I think that whole communication angle is something that I'm curious about GitOps too. So there's a real interrelation there. So thank you all. Have a great conference today. And stop by and say hello. We'll be around. Thanks. The NewStack Pancake Breakfast at the Cloud Foundry Summit in Basel, Switzerland is brought to you by the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Software is at the center of business, and open source is at the center of software. With Cloud Foundry, businesses can make running software at scale a reality. Learn more about Cloud Foundry at cloudfoundry.org. Listen to more episodes of the NewStack Analyst at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.